This region entered the current period with genuinely significant ambitions. The ambitions are still the right ones. The path forward is not to set them aside, it's to build the resilience at every level that makes them achievable in a world that has turned out to be less orderly than the plans assumed. Welcome to Resilience Reflections, a Flavors of Ambition mini-series. I want to start with something I've noticed across almost every crisis I've worked through with clients, and here there have been a few. The Y2K, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID, and so on. Every disruption leaves two things behind: the damage you can see and what it exposed that was already there. The conflict in the region did what decades of stable growth could not. It revealed the gap between how our organizations were designed to perform and how they actually performed under real pressure. Not the gap between our ambitions and our results. We're all familiar with that one. The gap between what we built and what we actually needed. That gap is what this episode is about. Not how to manage in the middle of a crisis, but how to design and build organizations where the gap is not so wide in the first place. I'm Jad Bitar, Managing Director and Senior Partner at BCG. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to take you through 4 topics that I think every leader operating in this environment needs to sit with: how organizations fail under compound pressure and how to design against it, why the traditional model of strategic planning is not fit for purpose in such environments, how the loyalty equation with your people has fundamentally changed, and what AI transformation is doing to the gap between what leaders are saying publicly and what their people are experiencing privately. And I'll end with something I think we don't talk about nearly enough: what all of this costs at a human level and what honest leadership through that cost actually looks like. I want to challenge something that most organizations believe about themselves: that they are prepared. They have crisis plans, they have business continuity frameworks, some even have wargaming exercises and scenario documents that run to dozens of pages. And yet, when disruption actually arrives, not as a single clean shock, but as a cascade of simultaneous failures, these plans usually underperform. Not because they were poorly designed, but because they were designed for a more orderly world. What we've seen in this region and what COVID demonstrated globally before it is that in a hyper-connected world, crises don't arrive sequentially. Infrastructure fails at the same time as supply chains. Workforce confidence collapses at the same time as institutional trust. The plans most organizations have were written for a world where you fix one problem before the next one arrives. That world is in the rearview mirror. When I look back at how organizations responded and how they failed, 2 patterns show up with remarkable consistency. The first is denial. Leaders who had plans saw the incoming crisis and quietly hoped they wouldn't need them. We saw it before the 2008 financial crisis. We saw it in the early months of COVID. The plan existed. The decision to trigger it was the hard part. And the longer we delay, the more expensive the eventual response. The second failure mode is more painful because it involves leaders who were generally trying to do the right thing. They triggered the plan and then discovered that the capabilities didn't exist. The COVID PPE scramble is the most visible example. Governments and organizations activated emergency protocols and found that the supply chains, their stockpiles, and manufacturing capacity their plans assumed simply were not there. Both failure modes feel avoidable in hindsight. They're almost never avoidable in the moment, which is exactly why you have to design for them before the moment arrives. Here's something that crisis plans almost never account for. They are written by people in a calm room, such as this one, imagining a rational response. They don't account for what acute stress actually does to human cognition, or for the group dynamics that suppress exactly the signal you need most, at exactly the wrong time. Under real pressure, authority structures become rigid, dissenting voices go quiet, and the people closest to the problem often feel least safe to escalate it. The binding constraint in a compound crisis is almost always human, not structural. But humans also surprise you, and this is the side I didn't fully appreciate early in my career. Informal leaders emerged. Improvised coordination filled the gaps that formal system left open. The most resilient organization I've worked with were not the ones with the best crisis manuals. They were the ones with the most intrapreneur and invested relationships. People who trusted each other enough to act without waiting for a playbook. I've been through many crises in my life, and one of them, and I think one of the most terrible I've gone through, is the port explosion in Beirut in 2020, in August 2020. I still remember where I was, what I was doing, and my immediate reaction was to leave everything and rush immediately to the area affected. And I'll spare you the details, but what I remember are two things. One is that BCG very quickly gave all of us who were in Lebanon a week to focus on family, and this was something extremely appreciated. And the second thing I remember is that I spent a week on the streets with people I didn't know, just basically helping extract people from the debris, cleaning up, and just coming together to deal with the aftermath of the situation. And for me, this is what I was talking about earlier, is that we felt that we had permission to do what we wanted to do. We didn't ask, we didn't wait for a plan, we didn't look for a playbook to know how to deal with these things. I remember at one point I was with a few guys that we converged together, and we were rummaging through a collapsed building. And then we started hearing somebody from the debris shouting for help. I've never been trained in doing anything like this. I don't even know how to do it, but we found ourselves just jumping and organizing ourselves. Some of us went to call for the Red Cross, others called the army bulldozers to build, while others were just trying to track where the sound was coming from and established communication with a gentleman that ended up being found hiding in a refrigerator that saved his life. So for me, this is an example of organizational adaptation and individual adaptation that I was trying to portray. One is that BCG leadership at that time was able to emerge and make decisions that freed some of us to be able to contribute to others. And some of us on the ground, were able to immediately self-organize and be able to contribute. So this is for me an example of resilience at two levels. So two things I would encourage every leader to act on. First, stress test your plans against compound scenarios. Not what happens if this one thing breaks, but what happens when three things break at once and two of them are things we didn't put in the scenario. The gap between planning and execution only becomes visible under real conditions, when surprises happen when you are rehearsing. Run exercises that create that visibility before you need it. Second, design explicitly for the human failure modes. Who has the authority to trigger the crisis plan? More importantly, what makes it psychologically safe for them to actually pull the trigger when the moment comes? If the answer to that second question is nothing in particular, you have a gap worth closing today. For decades, strategic planning rested on a reasonable assumption. The future is uncertain but broadly foreseeable. You could model the likely scenarios, build plans around the most probable ones, and update it annually. That assumption has been progressively dismantled by geopolitical shifts, technological acceleration, and most recently by AI, which is rewriting business models faster than any planning cycle was designed to track. The goal of strategy is no longer to predict the future. It's to build capabilities that can self-organize to respond to what the future brings. including the futures nobody put in the scenario deck. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in a practice. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, an investment made decades ago that at the time was difficult to justify on conventional economic grounds. The return was uncertain, the timeline was long, and a single decision maker applying standard return on investment logic would probably have killed it. But the organizational process kept it alive because someone asked a different question. Not what will happen, but what do we need to be able to do if something unexpected does happen? That pipeline has proved fundamental to resilience in the current conflict. The lesson is not that organizations are always smarter than individuals. I don't want you to take this with you. It's that good organizational processes are specifically designed to compensate for the cognitive limits that individuals face under uncertainty and time pressure. That's not a weakness to manage around. That's one of the core reasons organizations exist. Another thing leaders can do is shift the planning question from what will happen to what do we need to be able to do whatever happens. Then assess your organization actual capabilities against a range of scenarios, not just the most likely one. The gap between the capabilities your strategy assumes and the capabilities you actually have is where most disruptions become crisis. Everything I've described so far sits at the level of systems and strategy, but every one of those challenges lands ultimately on people. And across the work I've done in this region over the years, the same pattern has appeared in different forms. Organizations are asking more of people than they are currently able to support. That gap shows up differently depending on where you look. When crisis hits an expatriate majority workforce, it just doesn't create operational challenges. It creates a question that every employee is quietly asking themselves, is this still where I want to be? No contract, no retention bonus, and no carefully worded all-staff email fully answers that question. What answers it is something harder to manufacture. A genuine relationship between the person and the organization and between the person and the people they work with day in and day out. This is something you grow, you don't build. The broader context matters here. Professionals today have more freedom than ever to choose where and when they work, with far less friction in moving across borders. For organizations, this opens a global talent pool, but in a region where the workforce is majority expatriate, it also creates real vulnerability. And the deglobalization trend is adding a layer of complexity. Borders are tightening in some directions, talent pools are shifting, and the frictionless mobility that defined the last 2 decades is no longer guaranteed. Loyalty can no longer be assumed. It has to be earned continuously. And the organizations that hold their people through uncertainty are consistently better positioned to accelerate when conditions improve because they retain the institutional knowledge and the relationships that recovery actually runs on. So what can leaders do? Audit the emotional contract, not just the employment one. What do people experience day to day that makes them choose to stay with you? Not what does your EVP say, what do they actually feel? 2, build visible, meaningful connection to purpose, particularly for expatriate workforces who have made a real sacrifice to be here, and create genuine psychological safety so that people feel they can speak honestly during uncertainty rather than quietly deciding to leave. 3, treat retention as a leadership measure, not an HR metric, a leadership measure. The number of talented people who chose to stay through uncertainty and the quality of what they carried into the recovery is one of the truest indicators of whether your leadership through the disruption actually worked. Everything I've described in this episode, compound crisis, strategic uncertainty, workforce anxiety, and later AI pressure, all of it accumulates somewhere. And it lands on people. And the conversation about what that cost at a human level is almost entirely absent from professional life. The BCG CEO Insomnia Index confirms this is a global clinical issue. over 70% of CEOs report clinically high stress level. But CEO mental health is only the most visible part of the challenge. Stress, exhaustion, and the weight of sustained uncertainty don't stop at the C-suite. They move through the organization floor by floor, role by role. The leaders who model silence, who project certainty, that don't feel and absorb the cost quietly, inadvertently make it harder for everyone else to ask for help. I want to be honest about something here. We've built a professional culture around the idea that the right response to psychological pressure is to absorb it privately and keep moving. That culture has produced some extraordinary results, but it has also produced a great deal of invisible damage. Burnout that doesn't show up until it's a crisis, attrition that could have prevented, decision making degraded by exhaustion that nobody named. And this is the organizational cost. The cost to individual is much more pernicious. The organizations that will struggle most in the next decade are not the ones that fail to invest in resilience programs. They're the ones that treat resilience as a personal virtue, as something exceptional people have, rather than something thoughtful organizations build in their people. When resilience is a virtue, the cost of not having enough of it is carried privately and visibly. By the time it becomes visible, it's usually already expensive. Model honestly. Leaders who speak openly about the weight they carry create permission for everyone else to do the same. And that openness is itself an organizational capability. Shift from treatment to prevention. Address the root causes of burnout in how work is organized, not just in the support offered after the fact. Look at your meeting rhythms, the number of iterations to make a decision, your decision load, your senior team's recovery time. Organizations can accelerate indefinitely. Humans cannot. Design for that reality rather than ignoring it until it becomes a problem you can no longer ignore. In this episode, we're talking about resilience, and I have a problem with this word. Resilience at an organization level is something that I appreciate a lot, and I encourage organizations to have resilience. However, resilience at the individual level is something that makes me a bit frustrated. For me, the way I interpret individual resilience is basically giving up, is accepting the status quo and just dealing with the situation. When we look at organizational resilience, i.e., the ability to absorb as an organization environments that are changing, that you were not designed for or that you didn't plan for, fundamentally under this organizational resilience lie individuals that are entrepreneurial, that are driven, and that are actually fighting the status quo. So what we observe at one level as organizational resilience is in fact individuals that are refusing to accept the status quo, individuals that are pushing the agenda forward. I want to say something about AI that I think gets lost in most of the discussion. AI is not primarily an efficiency story, even though that's how most organizations are currently approaching it. That framing isn't wrong exactly, but it's the smaller version of the opportunity. The more interesting question is, what does AI make possible that was not possible before? What new responses, what new products, what new operating model, what new business model does it unlock? Organizations that treat AI purely as an automation or cost reduction tool will get the automation and cost reduction, but will miss the transformation. And in a volatile environment, the transformation is where the real value is. I want to start this section with something that should make us all slightly uncomfortable. AI is the one topic in this episode where the gap between organizations and their people isn't being created by an external shock. It's being created by leaders, often without realizing it. Every public commitment a leader makes to AI transformation does two things simultaneously. It raises market expectations and compresses the timeline to deliver, and it generates private anxiety in the people who are supposed to deliver it. Again, the BCG CEO Insomnia Index shows that most CEOs see AI primarily as an opportunity. Their employees are asking a very different question. What does it mean for me, for my role, my future? Those two conversations are happening in the same organization, largely without contact. Let me share an example. I worked with a client who made AI training mandatory across the organization. Sensible decision. You want your people fluent in the tools that are reshaping your industry. But a couple of months in, something odd was showing up in the feedback. Employees felt they were being trained to replace themselves. Think about that for a moment. The organization was investing in its people genuinely, meaningfully, and the message landing was, we're preparing you for a future that may not include you. That's not a communication failure. That's a strategy failure. The organization has never answered the most fundamental question its people were asking. And when leaders leave that question unanswered, fear fills the silence. Fear is a terrible operating environment. So what can leaders do? There are two ways to approach AI transformation, and the difference matters more than most organizations currently appreciate. The first, treat AI as a cost reduction tool. Automate the task, reduce the headcount, improve the margin. It works in a narrow sense. You get the efficiency. You also get the workforce that has watched its colleagues disappear, is privately convinced it's next, and will be performing accordingly. That's not a high-performance culture. That's a waiting room. The second approach uses AI to automate tasks and redeploy people toward creating new value, new products, new market, new capability, and new business models. It's harder. This requires a clearer organizational vision and a more honest conversation with your people. But it's the approach that builds the future rather than eroding it. So what can leaders do? Name the anxiety explicitly. Leaders who leave the "what does this mean for me" question unanswered allow fear to fill the silence, and fear spreads faster than any communication plan. Reframe AI adoption around value creation, not efficiency alone. Show people what becomes possible for them, not just for the organization, and invest in redeployment, not just upskilling. The goal is to expand what people can contribute, not to reduce how many people you need. And treat AI adoption as a capabilities question, not an efficiency question. Ask not just what it saves, but what it makes possible that changes your competitive position or your resilience posture entirely. The challenges I've described today were not created by the conflict. They were revealed by it. The compound crisis gaps, the outdated planning model, the change loyalty equation, the AI anxiety, the invisible cost of sustained pressure. None of this began when the disruption arrived. The disruption just made it impossible to look away. Across every topic, the same gap appeared in a different form. The distance between how we design our organizations and how our people actually behave under real pressure. The conflict made that distance visible. It was always there. The leader's job is not to close that gap permanently. If someone tells you that that's possible, they're selling you something. The job is to navigate it consciously, to understand when the gap needs an organizational response, i.e., stronger systems, clearer governance, better planning, and when it needs a human response, more trust, more honesty, more protection of the people doing the work. Knowing which is required and when is what leadership through uncertainty actually means. This region entered the current period with genuinely significant ambitions. Conflict creates doubt about those ambitions. It raises real questions about timing, sequencing, and what resilience actually has to look like at the national level, not just at an organizational level. My honest view, the ambitions are still the right ones. The path forward is not to set them aside. It's to build the resilience at every level that makes them achievable in a world that has turned out to be less orderly than the plans assumed. The disruption has given us information. What we do with that information is the leadership question. What does resilience mean to me personally? Not as a concept, not as a leadership framework, but as something lived. After 30 plus years in this work and after living through the last few years in this region, What resilience has come to mean for me is something quite specific. It's the ability to remain honest about the distance between where you are and where you need to be as an organization, without letting that distance paralyze you. It's not optimism, it's not stoicism, it's something closer to clear eyed motion. You see the gap, you don't pretend it's not there, and you decide that you still want to act anyway. I don't like resilience at the individual level. So for me, it's important to act and to move. So one of the first things I try to teach my kids about is don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. So don't wait for somebody to allow you to do something. Don't be self-limiting. When you're in a situation and you think you need to act in a certain way, act. And you might be mistaken. And somebody's going to come down hard on you, and then you just ask for forgiveness. But most of the time, you're going to get something out of it. So for me, this is the kind of behavior that will lead to organizational resilience, because you have individuals that are not paralyzed, waiting for orders, waiting for instructions, but they act, they move, they try to do something. They might fail, most probably they will fail. Somebody will come on them and slap them because they did this action, and it's okay. Just pick yourself up and continue your work.